let people start filtering in, and hopefully our fourth panelist is able to join. Especially since he's first in the program. So if he can't make it, that's okay. We can bump him to the end if he shows up late. So good afternoon, good evening. Leslie is not in this one, so I'm going to address that in a second. So good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to our 2 p.m. Eastern session on scholarship surrounding protest and social movements and social change that I put in the program simply as protest. Right now we have 3 papers. We're hoping for a 4th to show up. We'll have all of our presenters abide by the 10-minute presentation rule, the time limit. I will try to jump in at about 9 minutes to remind people that their time is drawing to a close. Please, if you have any questions for any of our panelists, post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we will address all of those once everybody's had a chance to talk. I don't want to forget to point out that everything on Stream 2 today is sponsored by Southern Illinois University Press. So please head over to their website to check out all of the great scholarship available there. And so since nobody came to this to listen to me talk, I'm going to turn things over to our panel. The first paper that we'll have today is the 2017 French Riots and Trust in the Police. Christof, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
All right, just trying to share my screen. So, all right, thanks very much. My name is Christof Nägel. I'm a PhD student at the German Police University. My co-author on this paper is Mark Lutter. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Wuppertal. And as you've just heard, our project is called the 2017 French Riots and Trust in the Police, a Quasi-Experimental Approach. The research question we wanted to answer was whether trust in the police suffers from grave cases of police misconduct in France. And our research design was enabled by the fact that on February 2nd, 4 French police officers brutally abused a young black man called Theo. And this in turn provoked the 2017 French riots, or the first wave of it. Our study exploits the coincidence that this event happened right during the fieldwork period of the European Social Survey, the ESS, in France, thus enabling us to conduct a natural experiment with survey data. There are, as a matter of fact, many studies with a similar research design, but most of them are either limited to very small or non-representative surveys, which of course is a problem in terms of external validity, or they have no randomization design, which poses concerns in terms of internal validity. Furthermore, we add a new national context to the debate, which is particularly interesting because most research in police trust or legitimacy is based in the USA or in the UK, and results tend to differ from theoretical expectations in different national contexts. So France might be interesting. Our basic theoretical idea is established from procedural justice theory, which states that your attitudes towards the justice system are dependent on the quality of personal interactions with the police. And since we are interested in vicarious experiences with the police, we combine these considerations with cultivation theory, which states that greater rates of media consumptions will increase the likelihood of consumers adopting worldviews as portrayed on the media, as well as new institutionalism, which understands the media as legitimacy mediators. And we combine these considerations via methodological individualism, because we're looking at a micro-level event that affects a macro-level outcome. So the first hypothesis is simply that we expect a reduction in trust in the police for people who were interviewed after the event. The second hypothesis is considering people with a migrant background to be more strongly affected by this effect. And this also relates to distributional justice theory, because the event might trigger the notion that Blacks receive an unfair treatment by the police more often than other ethnicities. And third and fourth hypothesis are then looking at the exacerbating effect of media, frequency of media consumption. The third one is looking at traditional media, and the fourth one at frequency of internet use. Our research design is relatively simple. It's just that we assign people who were interviewed before the event to the control group, and people who were interviewed after the event to the treatment group. And the event, as you can read, was initiated, or the riots were initiated by the alleged rape of a 22-year-old Black man called Theo with a baton. So pretty brutal stuff. This is a plot of the rise of the salience of the event. So the Google Trends that you can see here, and you can see that the Google Trends for the search theme Theo affair peaked around mid-February and then declined rather rapidly. And this is also something that we can see in the survey data. So these plots are results from the regression discontinuity design. Just a very quick introduction to RDD. The basic idea is that observations can be assigned to a treatment based on whether a continuous score, which in our case is days before and after the event, exceeds a known cutoff point. And this point, of course, is the day of the event. So that any observations who are barely above the cutoff and observations who are barely below it are essentially comparable to each other, and any differences in the outcome variable, which is trust in the police, can be attributed to the treatment effect. And as you can see, we always have a large difference in the intercepts of these models, indicating a pronounced treatment effect, which is significant for the optimal and the double optimal bandwidths, but not for this bandwidth, which is very short, might be attributable to a lack of statistical power. And but the other interesting fact is that we always have positive slope coefficients for the post-treatment models, which indicates that despite the high decrease in trust in the police, it might have been regained relatively quickly, at least to a certain degree. Next thing we did was using the whole bandwidth of the ESS and conducting simple OLS regressions. You can see the effect is still there. It is measured much more precisely, and it's not mediated by the control variables, but it is considerably lower than the effect of the RDD. The migrant moderator is also significant and somewhat more pronounced than the main effect, but the media effects are not significant, the media moderators, even though they point in the correct direction. Just a quick summary of our results. So we have a very high decrease in levels of trust in police in the week after the event. And it's somewhat lower, the effect size is somewhat lower in roughly 5 weeks after the event. And for people with a migrant background, it's still much more pronounced. And we also used a different item to construct the product term. We used the item that asked respondents whether they belong to an ethnic minority. And with this item, the treatment effect or the interaction effect is even more striking. So that's pretty interesting. The media consumption variables had no effect. And we used essentially all placebo tests that are recommended in the literature, which gives us some confidence in our results. These are in my eyes, the most important implications of our works, that we see a substantial loss of trust right after the event, and that it has been apparently regained to a certain degree after 5 weeks. However, that isn't true for people with a migrant background or people who belong to an ethnic minority, as for them, the effect seems to be way more persistent. And the police have been frequently called Teflon servers, where even major scandals have only short-lived impacts on trust or on attitudes toward the police. And our results seem to confirm this for France as well. But this seems not to be true for people with a migrant background or for people who were affected by the event in any other way. Yeah, that's just some information. If you want to contact me about the results or about our research project, yeah, and I think that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christof. Really interesting work. Our next paper, Striking for Climate, Media Representation of Belgian Youth Protests. Mafalda, you are up whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen. Can you tell me if it's working?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, and thanks to the organizers for running this conference. My name is Mafalda Pardal. I'm a researcher and assistant professor at Ghent University. And together with my colleagues Celine, Tack, and Frédérique Bawin, I've been working on this project where we're looking at how the youth climate protests in Belgium have been portrayed by the media. So just to give you some context on the start of the climate protests in Belgium, of course, the school strikes initiated by Greta Thunberg in August of 2018 were a great inspiration for the Belgian youth. But another important moment in Belgium that I want to highlight here was this demonstration organized at the start of the United Nations Climate Change Conference at the beginning of December of 2018, and which gathered about 65,000 people in Brussels. And despite this being the largest at the time climate demonstration organized in the country, just a few days later, Belgium was one of the only two European Union member states to vote against a revised legislation on energy efficiency. Now, as you can imagine, this position generated a lot of frustration, a lot of disappointment, and it is against this backdrop that two teenagers created Youth for Climate in Belgium, initially on Facebook, and called upon their fellow students to start skipping school and protest in the capital every Thursday. And they were able to mobilize a 20-week-long cycle of protest, which is quite exceptional for Belgium. Now, in our study, we were mainly interested in understanding how the youth climate protests have been portrayed by the Flemish or the Dutch written press in Belgium. And we did so by drawing on two key ideas from green criminology and cultural criminology studies. The first one is that activities such as environmental activism may be threatened by criminalization or repression. And the second one is that the media might actually play a role into that by either raising awareness or resistance to those processes and demands. So what we did was collecting newspaper articles through an online database of Belgian newspapers called Go Press Academic. And we included 6 out of the 8 newspapers published in Dutch in the Flanders and the Flemish region of the country, and covered the entire cycle of protests. So from January until June of 2019. And in the end, we had 382 news articles for our analysis. Our first finding is that the central focus of the majority of the news articles actually seem to be on describing the protests per se. So we found a lot of information about the size of the protests, about interaction and descriptions of the protesters. So this article I included here covers a demonstration that took place in a different city in Ghent, gathering 10,000 protesters. But also the international developments of the movement were also addressed by the media, as in this case as well, endorsements from public figures were also featured. And the protesters were also able to contribute to the newsmaking. Their voices were often included in the media reporting, either through interviews and citations, as in the title of this article, and also by including the slogans in pictures that accompanied this news reporting as well. At the same time, a significant part of the media coverage focused on the idea of climate truancy, on a debate of whether the protesters were entitled, of whether it was legitimate for the protesters to skip school in order to join and take part in this protest action. And this was to some extent also fed by the media. As you can see in this interaction that I included here, it is the journalist who actually phrases the question in those terms by asking, is skipping school the right way to convey that message? So the focus again here is on the method. Is skipping school the right way to do this? Is the protest the right way to protest, basically? Here I included our example just to show you that this expression of climate truancy was in fact often used in the media, here in the title referring to climate truants marching through the city. So this was the sort of terminology used. And in fact, we counted it, and the term truancy was used or included in the news reporting 570 times, much more often than the perhaps more neutral term strike, which only appeared 63 times. And there were also other allusions to rule breaking, such as references to study punishments. And while this kind of disciplinary action was not that severe, arguably, it again goes to re-emphasize this narrative of truancy, of rule breaking, and of punishment. Other institutional actors seem to also have adopted this frame or this approach. We found an example that I've included here of an attempt by the, at the time, Minister for the Environment to sort of delegitimize the protests by suggesting in a public speech that the youth climate protests were a matter for the intelligence services of the country, that there was some kind of hidden agenda behind them. And as you can see here, she also used, so the minister also used, she referred to them as truants. Several articles also played with the age of the protesters, infantilizing them with titles such as "Mommy won't let me go to Brussels to protest." And during a week of school holidays, a lot of the coverage actually seemed to question the seriousness of the engagement of these protesters, suggesting that while on holidays, they would probably be less likely to keep engaging in protest, that they would probably care less now about the environment. And that brings me to our last theme. What about the environment? What about the climate? And here, there is little to say, as the discussion of environmental issues was barely covered in the media. Only a few articles were actually dedicated to domestic or international climate or environmental policy, and the voices of academics or experts were barely included in the news reporting on these. So returning to our driving question, what have we learned about the media representation of youth climate protests in Belgium? Probably the first thing I want to say is that if it was today, I would probably have chosen a different title for this presentation, as it so often happens. We're still in the process of analyzing the data when we submitted our abstract to this conference. And so we thought at the time that Striking for Climate would be probably appropriate, an appropriate title. But I think if it were today, we would probably find a more suiting title, such as The Making of Climate Truants, which is actually the working title of a chapter we're working on at the moment. But beyond this, and just to highlight a couple of takeaway messages from our analysis, I'd say that at first sight, the media coverage of the protests was relatively benign. The protests gathered media attention for a relatively long period. The protesters were able to contribute to the newsmaking on these, and we found no evidence of formal criminalization or repression of the protests or of the protesters. However, and despite the visibility given to the demonstrations, this mediated construction of the protest action left the environmental issues in a very clear secondary place. And it introduced a perhaps more subtle narrative of delegitimization, or as some authors refer to as a case of mild criminalization of the protesters, by constructing this category of climate truancy and climate truants. And I should say as well that these findings seem to be in line with other media analysis of protests, both in Sweden and Germany, which I cite here below. But as the protests have globalized, it would be interesting to actually take stock of how the media is covering this issue, perhaps in other regions of the world. So I end my presentation with this invitation. So I hope some of you might want to look deeper into that in other regions of the world as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Our next presentation, could the George Floyd case be a turning point for the Black Lives Matter movement? Manos, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Good evening all, I'm Manos Karousos, a social scientist from Greece, and I'm representing Gyrus Institute. Let me share my screen so we can all help. Great. So, historically, cases which had to do with racial violence and especially interracial violence attracted public view's attention. At the same time, such cases can be characterized as difficult due to the many aspects that the researcher should bear in mind. If we look back at past eras, such as the slavery era, or later during the 20th century, thinking the Jim Crow law, we realize that America is full of violent events. Some of them turn into court cases, and some of them are already acknowledged from the elders through oral history. In my opinion, two cases that had a huge impact were the Emmett Till case and the Floyd case, and the George Floyd case. In this presentation, I will try to showcase where they consider as turning points. Can those two be linked? Are they connected? Could we find similarities or differences? Have we seen change? And what can we learn from these two cases? To begin with Emmett Till, in summer 1955, the 14-year-old Till was visiting his grandparents in Mississippi. On Wednesday, August 24th, Till, along with his cousin Maurice Wright and other family members, arrived at Bryant's grocery and meat market in Money. There, Emmett had an encounter with Carolyn Bryant, the store's owner wife. There are many theories concerning what happened that day, and also there is speculation on what Till told to Caroline during his visit to the store. The press wrote, according to Bryant's testimony, that either he whistled rudely to her or he grabbed her hand in his attempt to flirt with her. On the other hand, Simeon Wright highly doubted that testimony because, as he said, they have spent too little time there. 3 days later, Roy Bryant, accompanied by a group of people, visited the Wright household and kidnapped Emmett. 4 days later, the dead body of the teenage Emmett Till was found in the mud waters of the Tallahatchie River. A shocking murder. The reports of that time written that we found many wounds, as a hole half-inch square above the right ear, 2 or 3 gashes on the head. The head also had been crushed in and a piece of skull had been fell off into the boat. Some kind of instrument was used and brought that hole. The skin had slipped all over the corpse and the fingernails were gone from the left hand. Excuse me. The tongue was extending at about 2.5 or 3 inches. The left eyeball was almost ready to fall out. The odor was awful and it got neutral only after the undertaker's deodorant and barbed wire was around the neck of Till. Mommy Mobley decided to let the casket open during her son's morning ceremony so that other people could see what happened to her son. She also wanted them to realize that their sons could be in similar positions and that there were still places where they weren't safe at all. Needless to say that thousands of mourners gathered to see Till's dead body and prayed for him. Media press also took photos of Till's mutilated face and gave the public view maybe one of the most graphic moments in USA history, in my opinion. The murder trial was also a bitter experience not only for the victim's family, but for the whole Black community too. The all-white, all-men, no black, and no woman jury decided that the alleged killers of Emmett Till were not guilty. The composition of the court audience was 90% white, and it is easy to think that the prejudice existed and were still powerful. The death of Emmett Till undeniably saved the civil rights movement via numerous routes. Boycotts, peaceful protests, and rallies were organized from NAACP all across the USA. The most famous act was the Montgomery bus boycott, where almost all citizens of African-American descent refused to take a bus. That caused a financial disaster for the Transport Association. Members of the Black communities demanded equality. They were against any kind of discrimination, while at the same time they formed unions with the assistance of white people who were positive to the above ideas. To move forward, what it means to be Black in America, the George Floyd case. On May 25, 2020, George Floyd, a 46-year-old African-American, was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota, while being arrested for allegedly using a counterfeit. During the arrest, Derek Chauvin, a white police officer for Minneapolis Police Department, knelt on Floyd's neck for several minutes after he was already handcuffed and lying face down. 3 more police officers were present at that time and was J. Alexander Queng, Thomas Lehner, and Tu Tao. Floyd had complained about breathing difficulties during the whole incident, especially for the knee on his neck, and expressed the fear that he was about to die, and he called for his mother. After several minutes, Floyd passed out. The following day, after videos that made by witness and security cameras became public, fueled worldwide protests against police brutality, police racism, and the lack of accountability on all 50 states and globally. So the independent autopsy, which ordered by the Floyd family, revealed that the cause was a homicide caused by asphyxia due to neck and back compression that led to a lack of blood flow to the brain. The independent examiners also found that the weight on Floyd's back, the handcuffs, and positioning were contributory factors because they impaired the ability of Floyd's diaphragm to function. All four officers were fired and charged with the killing of George Floyd. The three of them paid bail to be released, and lately also Derek Chauvin paid the bail. But it is also argued if they would meet separate trial or not. So are Till and Floyd martyrs of the Black movement? Undeniably, the photos of Till laying in his coffin with his face mutilated and the head of George Floyd under Officer Chauvin's knee were shocking and had a huge impact globally. That's the power of the image. It can lead masses and protesters, enrage folks, inspire artists to explore the problems that the Black community had faced all these years. The media might be different, but the result was the same, to attract and provoke public opinion. Another tragic figure in both cases were the victim's mother. Many Mobley decided to leave her son's coffin open so everybody could feel her pain and realize the danger which we could be into. Some of Floyd's last words were the whispering, "Mama, Mama." We therefore see the importance of the mother in the African-American family, in the Black culture, in the Black community as an invincible, a holy force. Both cases have its similarities and differences. To be more specific, in both cases, we saw tremendous violence towards the victims. Thus, the Black community was fully shocked. From a sociological perspective, we can underline the diapole as the white as the oppressor and the Black as the oppressed. Needless to say that protest would used as an act of power from the masses. On the other hand, we meet many differences too. First of all, the media coverage. In Till's case, we have read newspapers and magazines during that era. In Floyd's case, we had social media coverage, so we should bear in mind that the broader audience got informed. Secondly, people wanted justice for Floyd too, while in Till's case, the white community were more cold, silent, and modest. During that time, were hard to express their true feelings, even if they understood that what happened to Till was a pure and unjustified crime. Also, in Floyd's case, we have seen mass marches, while on Till's case were significantly less and were coming strictly from the Black community. The last two extremely important differences are the age group of the victims. Till was a teenager, while Floyd was an adult. Also, their violators were coming from different backgrounds. Till's murder was an individual act, while Floyd's death was a result of police brutality. So how can these two events be linked? The answer is Black rage and change through protests. We have seen huge and sometimes peaceful marches. Are they connected? Of course, those two events have coiled the Black movement. Have we seen any difference during all these years? Basically, no, but we have seen many steps forward in topics that in the past were considered as taboo issues. So to conclude, we therefore see a growing need for change and acceptance. Thank you very much. On the last card, you can find my contact information for more information about my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Manos. Our final presenter today, Luis, if you're ready, discretionary powers in law enforcement from traditional and critical perspectives. Luis, please go ahead and share your screen if you'd like to. And the floor is yours whenever you're ready. You're muted, Luis.
Got it.
There you go.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk today about discretionary powers in law enforcement. And my contact information is on this first slide here. I'm going to begin with an overview. I've organized a presentation to cover 4 major themes. First, I touch upon sociological points relevant to police discretion. Second, I will present a brief historical overview of the topic, and then I will contrast the Republican versus the Democratic record in American politics. I present the Republican and Democratic records as political ears to the traditional and critical perspectives on police discretion. And I conclude with two sidebar examples of these competing perspectives in police discretionary power. So law enforcement discretion refers to the inevitable reality that police officers make choices about which laws to enforce and how to interact with local residents when enforcing those laws. Enforcing the law is one of the many tasks assigned to police officers, which include order maintenance, peacekeeping, crime prevention, and criminal investigation. The focus here is primarily on political debates about police officers' decisions to make a stop and issue an arrest, including the police-citizen interaction during that encounter. Stop and frisk is a police tactic that is heavily reliant on police discretion. The idea behind stop and frisk is that low-level citations and arrests are an effective crime control strategy. Stop and frisk is premised on the notion that patrol officers are socialized into an occupational subculture where they learn how to recognize suspicious activity. Stop and frisk policing is a subset of broken windows policing. Broken windows policing rests on the notion that police occupational subculture grants them special knowledge to identify social factors that create disorder and contribute to crime. This insider knowledge allows police to detect the signs of a potential drug dealer or an individual carrying a gun. Stop and frisk is a police practice that allows officers to stop and search people that give off signs that they might be in possession of drugs or firearms. Critics contend that police practice allows officers to discriminate against racial and ethnic minority groups using the decision to preserve public safety as a cover for their biased decision-making. The Democratic and Republican parties both defended broken windows theory and stop and frisk policing until Black Lives Matter protest called into question systemic biases in the exercise of law enforcement discretion. Community activists argue that discretionary powers should be made more transparent, and officers who make rash decisions should be held accountable. A Minneapolis police officer's decision to kneel on the neck of a Black man for nearly 9 minutes as he struggled to breathe put the issue of police discretion in the spotlight. The rule of law is central to American democracy and is supported at local, state, and federal levels by law enforcement agencies and agents. However, in American democracy, there exists two rules of law, one for whites and one for non-whites. For white folk, law and order means public civility and justice in the courts for those who violate our collective morals coded as criminal law. Modern policing is linked to the establishment of a racial hierarchy in American society, from the slave patrols to the Black codes to extrajudicial violence, terroristic violence by the Ku Klux Klan and other groups defending whites' interests. Local police solidly preserved this racial hierarchy. Anything that challenged the racial hierarchy could be seen as a crime punished by the law or by the lynchings that stretched from Mississippi to Minnesota. The assumption that police in America operate as a purely administrative bureaucracy to enforce a colorblind rule of law minimizes the historical ties of policing with efforts to maintain this racial hierarchy in the United States. The tough on crime consensus that emerged within both the Republican and Democratic parties in the decades following the collective struggles for civil rights, law enforcement were at the forefront of this tough on crime consensus. During the last 2 decades of the 20th century, the American political system strengthened the role of local city police to make arrests in the war on drugs and the war on crime, leading to the system that we call mass incarceration. The Democratic and Republican parties each pursued law and order campaign strategies to win local and national elections that strengthen the state's power to punish. The Democratic and Republican law and order consensus nurtured the broken windows metaphor and stop and frisk policing. Mayor Giuliani and Police Commissioner Bratton in 1994 published a document titled Police Strategy Number 5, Reclaiming the Public Spaces of New York City. In this law and order doctrine, the authors note that broken windows policing is a precept for stop and frisk practices. New York police officers were instructed to define deviance up. Law enforcement were instructed to exercise discretionary powers to uphold a uniform standard of civility and mutual respect in all the neighborhoods of the city. Previously unenforced deviance would become crimes admissible for prosecution. Loud cars, alcohol sales to underage buyers, patronizing prostitutes, and graffiti all fell under the rubric of law and order, of low-level disorder offenses for which patrol officers were instructed to issue citations and make arrests. Over the course of the next 20 years, increased officer discretion to make misdemeanor arrests established an unmistakable pattern of institutional bias in law enforcement. By 2015, 45% of misdemeanor arrests were of Black individuals, 35% of Hispanic individuals, and 13% of white individuals. These patterns reflected the cosmopolitan values of New York City and the era of stop and frisk policing. The May 25th, 2020 killing of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers was captured by witness videos. His death sparked massive public protests during a worldwide pandemic in the month of June. For many who viewed the video, a police officer's decision to choke a handcuffed man to death is a vivid example of systemic bias in law enforcement and law enforcement discretionary behavior. This police killing was in line with other deaths that occurred in the summer of 2004 when Eric Garner was killed by police. His death was also captured in cell phone video, and he was also heard uttering the phrase, "I can't breathe," as officers choked the life out of him. In the summer of 2005, there was a shooting death of Michael Brown, an unarmed Black teenager in the suburbs of outside St. Louis, Missouri. And in the spring of 2015, there was the death of Freddie Gray, a 25-year-old Black man who died while in police custody. These events led to massive civil unrest. Riots broke out in Baltimore following Gray's funeral. These stories reveal troubling patterns in police discretionary behavior.
Luis, you have about 1 minute left.
Okay. Many Republicans believe that policing is a specialized skill that should be left up to police officers to determine how to exercise that discretion. For many Democrats, the belief exists that that police community relations are more important than granting to police officers full and complete power to exercise discretion. And in the run-up to the 2016 election, there were two events that contrasted these two competing positions. During the 2016 Republican convention, Blue Lives Matter chant was uttered throughout the convention halls when Sheriff David Clark delivered his address to the Republican National Convention. And the 2016 Democratic Party embraced Black Lives Matter protests by recognizing institutional and systemic racism in our society. And here's a few suggestions for further readings. And I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our presenters today. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. Nothing has come in during the talks, but if you have questions now for any of our presenters, please feel free to post those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I know that we covered a lot of pretty heavy topics today, so if people need to take a minute to process everything, I certainly appreciate and respect that. I mean, if any of our panelists have any questions for each other, you can chime in too. Okay, well, hearing nothing and seeing nothing in chat or in the Q&A, I want to take this opportunity to thank, again, all of our panelists today for their really important and fascinating work. Thank you to everybody in attendance for coming out to CrimCon. Oh, no, we do have a question coming in. Thank you. Just under the wire. So for Luis, our questioner asks, I was wondering, do you think that policing needs a complete overhaul, or will certain types of implicit bias training assist in bettering policing?
My opinion is that a complete overhaul is in order. I don't think that the current institution as it exists is fixable. I think we have to redefine what the role of law enforcement is. It's too vast and too broad, and we need not have officers be first responders to instances where there are individuals in public that are suffering from mental health breakdowns. That's the number one thing. The deinstitutionalization of our state-run mental health asylums is a primary factor for what we are seeing being problematic with policing and mass incarceration today. Prisons serve that dual purpose of places where we send people for punishment and also places where we send people that are too poor to afford mental health services to receive a diagnosis and treatment for the first time. So I think we do need to overhaul completely, not only our police, city police, but our entire criminal justice system.
Thank you. Yeah, and I just want to kind of add to that. I think that the idea of implicit bias training, some people have viewed that as like a catch-all solution to a lot of institutional problems, and it's been really in vogue for the last 5 years or so. And I think we haven't really seen a lot of evidence that it works. I mean, this is my opinion. I think it's an interesting like classroom exercise to show students that they have these biases, but using it as a solution for systemic problems doesn't work so well. Again, this is just my opinion. Another question for you, Luis. They write, in regard to the response to mental health consumers, what could mental health professionals do? Should they respond to a situation that becomes hostile and dangerous for them? This is a big concern for both mental health professionals and law enforcement. So I guess trying to navigate that overlap between, mental health concerns that may become violent.
I think first and foremost is addressing the issue of privatized healthcare. Mental health care is healthcare, and without universal healthcare that includes mental health services, we're at a loss. We're not going to be able to confront the issue of the patients that are in dire need of mental health services. So I think it's unfair to lay it all at the feet of those who provide treatment and offer support. I think it's those of us who make decisions about whom we're going to vote for and what sorts of policies we're going to support. We have to take a good hard look at ourselves and make concerted efforts to revamp the way that we deliver mental health services and the way that we redefine the role of local city police. I hope that answers. I don't know if that was a long-winded way of saying that. I agree with the question, but I think the question requires us to think more holistically about what mental health professionals' role is in society.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for a great question.
Any other questions for any of our panelists? Okay, now I'm gonna bring this to an end. Thank you again, everybody, for coming out today. If you do want to follow up with any of our presenters, they have their contact information was in their presentations, and this will be posted live or posted to YouTube in a few weeks' time. And we'll send out an email blast when everything is available for people to revisit. Everybody's doing amazing work. Thank you to our audience. I hope that everybody's been enjoying CrimCon so far. As we start into the tail end of day 2. Hey, if you're sticking around on this stream, I have to stop the webinar for recording purposes and restart it at about 3 p.m. Eastern time. Thanks again, everybody, for coming out. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.